want an excuse to stop thinking, and they also want an excuse to stop listening to disturbing things. And these are ways of doing that. I think these things were coming anyway, but I used to think I'd be dead before they arrived. I'm astonished to find myself still alive when it's happening. It was a hard battle to fight in the first place. And I don't think there's any shame in admitting that you were flattened by a steamroller.
Hello and welcome to Unlocked. I'm Laura Dodsworth. I'm very excited about today's guest. He is one of the UK's most esteemed journalists and writers. I turned to his writing quite early in lockdown because he's one of the few prominent voices who was challenging the restrictions, showing us what's happening before our very eyes, and giving hope about the direction of travel to people up and down the country. He is, of course, Peter Hitchens. Welcome, Peter.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining me. The first thing I want to talk to you about today is why Lockdown Sceptics lost the argument. Our Prime Minister Boris Johnson told us on the 23rd of March last year that we must stay at home. And we're still in lockdown. One way or another, a year on, we've been living with restrictions.
Could I first of all start by saying I don't think the Lockdown Sceptics lost the argument. They lost something just as significant but not as shameful to lose, which is the propaganda war. It's very hard to fight against two things. It's hard to fight against fear once it's been unleashed, because fear destroys rationality and makes people almost totally uninterested in facts and in reason, the things which you would normally deploy, which honest people have to deploy. And the other thing is, of course, that in terms of propaganda, the skeptics had nothing like the power which the state has, and which a state which in this case was supported by organs like the BBC and which was not challenged in any serious way in Parliament, an opposition party which failed to oppose. So it was a hard battle to fight in the first place. And I don't think there's any shame in admitting that you were flattened by a steamroller if you were just yourself a human being. That's if a steamroller is pitted against a human being, nothing will change the outcome, and that is how I feel. I feel steamroller. We didn't lose the argument. Our arguments were and remain correct. But the deeper thing and the understanding of what happened took a long time to clarify itself in my mind. I knew instinctively, and I think instinct is actually it's very rapid reasoning, which you're often not aware of. I knew instinctively that something very serious was happening when it began. I think I would say it's because I have lived in and visited so many unpleasant and oppressive countries that I've become very conscious of the characteristics of liberty and of how quickly and easily they can be disposed of, and how in many cases liberty is not very popular. And when I saw this, I think I instinctively saw a very large threat to the liberty of the individual and pitted myself against it before I fully understood the extent and power of it. And I think also before the people who did it understood it. This is a huge argument among skeptics, those who believe that in some way this was planned or the result of a deep-laid lobby or something of that kind, and people like me who say, no, it wasn't planned. It was the consequence of a huge number of things all coming together at the same time, leading to this disaster. We say something similar about a lot of the First World War. No one really expected the world to be as revolutionized as it was after 1918, or intended it, but the fact was that a number of forces took advantage of it and changed the world. And they're changing the world now again. And a long period, as we've had now, of total holiday from normality is an ideal time in which new arrangements can be introduced, and people forget what they used to have. The other thing about freedom is that it's like clean water and clean air. If you've got it, you're not conscious of it. And therefore you're not very good at spotting when it's being slowly taken away from you.
I think it's a really interesting point about instincts, because I had the same instinct right at the beginning, and I think there's a way in which rationality has been people's enemy. People don't want to believe what they can see happening in front of their eyes. It doesn't feel rational.
Well, it's not. I think I was probably wrong when I said they didn't want to believe. So they felt that it was too disturbing to believe what was apparently going on. They couldn't. You hear a prime minister say, "Stay at home." You think, well, this is a joke. This is what when people used to make jokes about having military putsches in Britain and how the junta would go on television and say, go quietly to your homes and introduce house confinement, and there would be people on the streets denouncing you for going out. It's ridiculous. It never happens here. And here it was happening here. The Prime Minister comes on the television and announces by decree that we're no longer supposed to leave our homes except under specific, very narrow circumstances. And we don't want to think. Actually, we've just been told we're under house arrest by the government. You don't want to think that because the implications of it are so colossal that you turn away from it in amazement and incredulity.
Absolutely. And there's another added layer to that as well. He told us on the 23rd of March that we must stay at home. It wasn't actually law until the 26th of March. So the whole thing started with, I'm not sure whether I should call it a legal fiction, but we weren't. Yes, it was a bluff.
A lot of it was bluff. As so much government is bluff. But it works. If you look as if you know what you're doing and you look as if you're justified, then it will happen. It used to, of course, be a national joke in Britain that the Germans were so easy to bluff. There's the famous incident of the Captain of Köpenick, which was written into a play by Karl Sudmeyer in pre-1914 Berlin. A man dressed himself up in a military uniform and commandeered the local town hall and the treasury of it simply by ordering people about and pretending to be an officer, and it worked. And everybody in Britain said, oh, those Germans, they're so easy to order about, all it takes is a uniform. And we thought we were superior to them. It turns out that when somebody stands up and does the equivalent, it really is like the Captain of Köpenick. Somebody stands up and says, right, you must do all these crazy things. Everybody agrees. How high?
I think there's something else to this, and it's like a kind of a feeling of mass delusion. I'm already worried about how much this is going to upset people that I'm saying this. I'm not saying that COVID itself is a delusion. I'm saying that there are elements of the response.
Now, shall we turn to the camera together and say, delusion. No, we don't think COVID is a delusion. It was real. It really happened. It is a disease. It kills people. It's a bad thing. We're against it. Can we have that clear?
Yeah, done. Caveat emptor.
We've got that out of the way.
We've got that out of the way.
So it's not the flu. No, it's not the flu. We don't think it's the flu. And no, we don't think it's anything to do with Bill Gates. Have we got that clear as well? Are there any other things we need to get out of the way of this?
No, that'll do.
This is ludicrous
but
rubbish that you have to confront every time you talk about it.
You do. Yeah. Otherwise, you just incur irate bots and trolls on Twitter.
People want an excuse to stop thinking, and they also want an excuse to stop listening to disturbing things. And these are ways of doing that.
I don't have any doubt in the future people are going to look back and be writing PhDs about mass delusion and mass hysteria.
I hope so, but I'm not as sure as you are.
But I thought that by now that the hysteria might have burnt through a little bit. But it's as though it's not even about the fear now. We've created rituals of fear which keep it all going along.
About fear. It still is about fear.
Do you think?
Oh, very much so. I'm very lucky. I'm not a state-registered coward. If you confront me with physical danger, I'll flee from it like anything. But one of the things about doing what I do, and having been a reporter and going abroad, is that on a couple of occasions I've been in situations where I've been told that something I was about to do was terribly dangerous and risky, and but I had to do it in the nature of things. I either did it or I basically would have to stop doing my job. So I did it, and I found that an awful lot of the fear which is built up around things is not justified. And I think having passed through that particular barrier, I find any attempt to make me frightened that isn't to do with immediate physical danger pretty unconvincing. I'm very lucky in that way, but most people aren't. They haven't had that kind of good fortune. And they are therefore tremendously suggestible. One of the most fascinating things about the start of this was how many people who I regarded as well-educated and highly intelligent who fell for it were completely and utterly cultized and hid in their homes and would cross the street rather than come within 9 feet of me. That wasn't because they didn't like me, because they saw me as a mobile plague pit. And they were genuinely afraid that from me they would catch a disease which would kill them. And it's still a lot of them like this. And they genuinely believed that the government had made a proportionate estimate of the danger and was acting sensibly. And there wasn't any arguing with them. It was very, very quickly apparent that there wasn't. So I didn't. I just decided that there simply wasn't any point. And it was to say that the only thing to do was be nice to them.
How long do you think it takes for a mass delusion to burn through? Or how long can people sustain
never.
fear for?
I mean, you can think things can go on for years, and people have all kinds of delusions which continue because they suit them for years and years. One which I will often cite, which gets me into the most terrible trouble. If you look into the British bombing of Germany during the Second World War, it's militarily unjustifiable and fantastically, tremendously inhumane. And involved the mass killing of innocent women and children on a colossal scale. And it ought to be, we ought by now to have reached and say, well, that was a mistake. Mm-hmm. But you raise that in almost any circles now, and you will still find people get fantastically angry with you. They want to believe that it was justified. I don't blame them. I used to believe it was justified. But delusions can last forever. There's an awful lot. I wrote a book about the Second World War, which mainly got me accused of being a Nazi sympathizer, which I am not, or of thinking that Churchill should have made a peace with Hitler, which I do not think, and all kinds of things like that, pointing out that a lot of the things that we believe about 1940 simply aren't true. But the main result of this was abuse and misrepresentation, because people like their illusions. They have illusions because they like them. They live their lives by illusions. All of us, to some extent. There is there's that extraordinary moment in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, where he says, I had thought there was a material world in which we live, and I now know that there is no such world. I think I know what he means, but you have to keep imagining around you the semblance of the world which you think you've been brought up to believe in, or it's almost impossible to live normally.
There should be a weight of rational evidence now to show people that generally, if they're under 70 and they don't have other health problems, they're at very, very low risk from COVID. But I think we've created rituals of fear that perpetuate the narrative, like, masks and social distancing and standing on dots.
Masks comfort the people who wear them, and they make them think that they're doing an unselfish thing. And therefore, there are two very powerful reasons why people do it. And of course, there's the third one, which is that they can get into quite a lot of trouble if they don't. And so there's, again, you can't expect to challenge that among most people. Most people will accept it for one of those reasons, and in some cases, all three. And it's comforting to them. And again, you still talk about reason, but all the time we are unreasonable. So if you get a train crash, and maybe 70 or 80 people die in it, it's tragic. But it's extraordinarily unusual, and it's very unlikely to happen to you. But the number of people travelling by train will drop after those train crashes. People will go, and instead they'll drive around in cars. Whereas all the statistics, if you examine them, will tell you you're thousands of times more at risk of injury and death than you would be if you travelled on a train. But reason goes out of the window so often in the reactions which we have to events. It's not uncommon. The foolish thing in some ways is to rely on reason, in fact. So many things I argue, whether it be the question of whether we should reintroduce selective grammar schools, or the national drug policy, or the real problems of the police. And I've gone into it. I spent months in the archives finding out the facts about these things, and I present them in books, and nobody reads them. Because what they say is opposite to what they want to think, so they pay no attention. They don't even read them, let alone read them and say, this is rubbish. Actually, it isn't. But again and again, in any argument I care to have, I come up against the same thing. People believe what they want to believe, and you won't shift them by fact and reason, because they're not really very interested in it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the reasons why Lockdown Sceptics lost the argument, for want of a better word, because they thought that they could argue with facts, and facts weren't the right tools.
So the other side had benevolence on their side. People thought and still think that the government and SAGE and all this are working for benefit, and that they really do know how to protect them from danger. So they rally around them.
And what do you think the truth is?
Well, I think that the metaphor that I would have come up with from the start about this is the government is like a man who burnt down his house to get rid of a wasp's nest. I think that they grotesquely overreacted. They used means which would probably not be particularly effective, and they copied in a moment of panic the most totalitarian and unfree society on earth because they thought that it might work. And now that they've done it, as so often with people who make very grave mistakes, now they've done it, they don't admit they've made a mistake. They'd much rather carry on doing it than make a mistake. Like the person who's driving you along and takes a wrong turning. And the one thing he's never going to do is to admit that you did the wrong thing and go back. He might eventually go by an immense detour round to back where he started, not at any stage admitting he was wrong, but he will never say, I got it wrong back there. I've got to turn around. People won't do it. They're too proud.
When the first footage came out of people trapped in their apartments in Wuhan, and even one, famously welded in, home, I think most of us in the West just felt pity. I felt pity for China, and yet we copied lockdown. Given that that's happened, what's next? What do you see next for society?
I think that there will be a gradual fading away of restrictions to begin with. Of course, you can never rule out the possibility of a third wave, so-called, and a restoration of them. But I think that by allowing the government to push them around in this way and to take away their liberties without protest in this way, then society as a whole, the Labour Party, Parliament, the media, and anybody else who should normally be involved in upholding the standards of civil society, allowed the country to harden into this new regime of the health of the people being the highest law, taken literally, that is to say that from now on, nothing, neither the courts nor the 1689 Bill of Rights, nor Magna Carta, nor the Human Rights Charter, if you prefer that, none of these things should be allowed to interfere in any way with the government's ability to order us around in the cause of public health. And we've granted that, and of course that is, again, it's a metaphor for a benevolent totalitarianism, because you're basically saying to the government, you're so good, your aims are so good, that nothing you can do can be wrong from now, and it shouldn't and won't be challenged. The thing that's probably shocked me most about this, and my own trade has for a long time forgotten its proper role, but the failure of the courts which you remember enthusiastically joined in challenges to the government's European policy, the failure of the courts even to be willing to hear a case for judicial review on these immense powers which the government arrogated to itself was, to me, the most astonishing thing. I had thought that if anybody could get the money together and the lawyers together, they could get this into court, but the courts simply wouldn't hear it. When that news came through, I thought, that's it. We haven't got anything. We've got no hope at all. We're stuck with this now. Mm. None of the mechanisms, none of the brakes, but the handbrake didn't work, the foot brake didn't work, the emergency brake didn't work, nothing worked. Nothing could stop it, or even slow it down. I think for a very long time, this country has been abandoning its liberty in return for what it believed to be security. I think the first stage of this process was over terrorism after September 11, 2001. And again, the state was given and took enormously excessive powers. I have another personal theory, which is if the state increasingly fails to police normal crime, which we have, then it creates a demand for a more authoritarian society, which it has done. I think that lots of tendencies are pushing together towards a strong state and a less free society. The thing which was most alarming to me personally about it was the way, certainly around about the late autumn, when the suggestion was being made by fellow members of my trade, more or less, that people such as me who'd argued against the strangulation of society were responsible for the deaths of people who had died from COVID. And that seemed to me to be a step towards totalitarianism, which I found quite chilling.
It's been a really frightening call to hear journalists call for other journalists to be censored. It's been one of the really disturbing elements of this. That kind of attitude is a precursor to a more totalitarian society.
Well, again, the problem is with language. The moment you start introducing, I hesitate. I think I did use it or two. The moment you start using the word totalitarian, you are raising in people's minds spectres of the Soviet or the National Socialist regimes, which of course came to power in ways which are unimaginable to us, are largely unknown. The BBC, for instance, when it marked the centenary of the Russian Revolution, didn't even know there'd been two Russian revolutions in 1917. People don't know what happened or how it happened. But what they do know is they've all seen the pictures of Stalin. They've seen the accounts of the Gulag. If they're at all intelligent, they've read Solzhenitsyn. And they also know or think they know all about Nazi repression. And these things are so extreme and distant to them, and seen through a lens of distance, that they can't really believe that anything of that kind could happen to us. So you lose your audience the moment you start using that kind of language, which sometimes is difficult. Sometimes you do have to do it, because the essence of totalitarianism is utopianism, which is a belief that you, the government and the state, are so good, and the party, if there is a party, are so good that nobody really is entitled to challenge you, and that it's that those who disagree with you are not just wrong but bad. But of course, that's been a tendency in the Western left for a long time. I have no personal animus against my left-wing opponents. I don't. They are my opponents. They're not my enemies. There are very few of whom I can say the same thing in return. There is a feeling that one gets when one walks into a BBC building, that you're surrounded by people who think, crikey, what's that villainous human being doing here? I'm not given any credit even for being human. Because I hold certain views, I am a wicked person, not just a wrong person. Mm-hmm. And so this has been accelerated by these events. It's hard to draw them together in any other way than to say there's been a long-term tendency, really since the Cultural Revolution got underway, towards a new benevolent state. And the initial wave of Blairism, you possibly remember in 1997 they actually said, I think in their manifesto, that New Labour is the political arm of the British people as a whole. A statement which people who were alert when they heard it were very alarmed by. They didn't repeat it, but I think it's what they thought. I think our new ruling elite does believe it's the political arm of the British people as a whole. So if you don't agree with them, so you're probably not really included in the British people as a whole.
Okay, well, let's talk about vaccine passports. Because you said in a recent article, I've been more or less forced to have an immunisation I would not normally have bothered with. That caused quite a lot of controversy. Do you think you've given up real freedom by giving in to the idea of a vaccine passport?
Oh, I think, of course. I've spent the past 20 years recognising that I've been defeated on more and more things. I just have. And people say, they then call you a defeatist. A defeatist is somebody who calls for defeat, who tries to make defeat happen, not someone who admits that it has happened. There's no point in pretending after you've been defeated that you've been victorious, or after you've been wounded that you're unhurt. Everybody laughs at the Monty Python Black Knight sketch, but they don't ever seem to apply it to themselves. I mean, if you have been steamrolled by an enormous physical and propaganda power, and you've lost a very significant political battle, there's no point pretending. If you've lost an election, you don't you don't go around saying, actually, we won, unless you're Donald Trump. If you do, people will think you're mad. You have to, if you're to take any further steps in politics or life, if you have been defeated, then the essential first step is to admit that you have been, and then to work out what you're going to do next. Going around shouting, no, I haven't been defeated, when you have, or I haven't been wounded when you've got two arms and one leg missing, is just ridiculous.
I think, though, that two reasons it bothered people was, first of all, you're saying you've been defeated before we actually have vaccine passports. So we don't have them yet. But I think the second thing is,
you only need to be able to read to see that restrictions on travel based on whether you've had a vaccine are being crafted now by governments. The fact that they haven't actually been formally hardened into a vaccine passport doesn't mean that if you're thinking of, I'm not going to go over this anymore because it causes nothing but trouble. But if you're seriously thinking of traveling, particularly to countries with extremely complex visa requirements, sometime in the next 9 months, if you seriously think you're going to be able to go anywhere unless you've had a vaccination, then you're deluding yourself. If you think you'll definitely be able to get somewhere if you've had a vaccination, you're also deluding yourself. But I have private concerns in this matter, which are nobody's business but my own.
The second point I wanted to raise, though, was about hope. I think the reason it upset people and it caused a lot of controversy is because actually you've given people a lot of hope.
Well, I don't know why. I didn't say anything to suggest that I was offering hope. It would have been irresponsible for me to do so. I mean, I knew from many, many previous battles that the intelligent, reasoned side generally loses. And at one point, very, very early on in the whole business, I turned to people who were very close to me. I said, "I'm not sure I can be bothered with this anymore. It's nothing but it's nothing but rubbish. You stand here, you speak the truth, and you're hosed down with slime. I've had enough." And if it hadn't been for the appearance of Lord Sumption on the scene, I think I would probably have canned it then. At that point, and this is the thing which makes me very angry at these morons who accuse me of defeatism. At that point, I was pretty much the only person of any prominence at all who was raising any doubts. The only one. And as I say, if Jonathan Sumption hadn't weighed in, which was partly my doing, I should say, it's a complicated story, but I helped it happen. If he hadn't weighed in, then I think the chances were that I would have said, okay, that's it. What's the point of enduring any more of this slime? I've had so much slime in my life, and you do get tired of it. There's no question of it. And then to get slimed for being sick of slime is an added joy. But my contempt for people who accuse me of things like that is boundless. I mean, which one of them can turn and say that they undertook any act of individual courage about this at all? And when they can come and attack me for supposed betrayal and all the rest of it. Otherwise, they're going to get stuffed.
Courage and hope looks different for different people.
Maybe they do, but if you don't, I have been very, 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 very sure in this business not to engage in anything of that kind. I haven't attacked my opponents. I haven't mocked people for wearing masks. I haven't attacked people for anything other than failing to use positions of strength which they had to help me when it might have made a difference.
Well, I'd say this is one reason why you gave me hope all the way through, because
I wasn't offering
like
you hope. Well, I was. It was quite plain. You saw one person on one national newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, on his own, putting up opposition. What does that tell you?
That there's always hope. No,
it doesn't. It tells you. It tells you that all the forces are on the other side. There is the fact that there is one voice means that there were very nearly none. All I could offer people, and all I intended to offer people, was the reassurance that those who felt the same as me were not on their own. But if anybody had asked me and said, "Do you think you can win this?" I'd have said, "I've never yet won anything of this kind. I don't win. If you want to find somebody who's going to lead you to victory, then my record is poor."
Sometimes hope isn't always about victory.
Hope is not about, for me, I long ago gave up temporal hope. I don't have any temporal hope at all. I think we're in a civilization moving rapidly towards its own ruin, and I have done for some time. The books that I wrote, when I wrote my first book in 1999, The Abolition of Britain, I wrote it in the illusion that by pointing out the dangers that face the country, I might be able to do something to reverse it. In the subsequent books which I've written, which I now am hoping to have republished en bloc as a volume called The Obituary of Britain, it became clear to me that what I was doing was recording the death. I was basically doing an autopsy of a dead country. I don't have any temporal hope at all. I haven't had for a very long time. I only have eternal hope, and that's a completely different thing. Courage has a value of itself, just as the truth has a value of itself. Mm-hmm. C.S. Lewis said that none of the virtues were of any value without courage, because without it you couldn't pursue any of them. But they don't have, in my view, a temporal value. The this is the thing, one of the few things I quote from G.K. Chesterton, who I'm not that keen on, is from one of the Father Brown stories, where he says, what we do here matters somewhere else. And what we are often seeing is the wrong side of the tapestry and completely misunderstanding the pattern of it, because we're looking at it from the wrong side. We don't understand. But the virtues are the virtues under all circumstances. But they don't offer temporal hope. And if you take them to offer that, then you will often be very, very badly disappointed. I've lived a very full, interesting, sometimes difficult life, and I know exactly how bad I am in all necessary detail.
What about other people? Do you think you've learned anything new about other people?
Well, I've learnt in practice what was theoretically true, which is that enforced solitude and enforced inactivity are tremendously damaging to the body as well as to the soul. I think that's one of the reasons why the death rate in this country has been so high, but that's a personal theory of mine.
Mm. And is there anything you could say that would at this stage offer hope to people who are watching, people who do want to see lockdown end? And
well, no, these extremities have to end because they're economically and politically unsustainable. But I think people have accepted and did accept in March, April, May and June last year a more confined and restricted and limited life, and that's what we're now going to live. And it's going to be accompanied by accelerated economic decline. I think these things were coming anyway, but I used to think I'd be dead before they arrived. I'm astonished to find myself still alive when it's happening. But I'm not surprised by the direction, because the belief in this country, particularly in liberty under the law, which used to sustain freedom, seems to have declined so sharply that hardly anybody can be bothered to believe in it or defend it anymore. So if you don't, freedom is not a thing which which exists outside the human heart. If the human heart doesn't embrace and defend it, then it won't survive. And we are now living in a less free world. That's permanent. Just how much less free it is impossible to tell at the moment.
So tell me more about what you think could be coming, because you've mentioned China, you've mentioned Russia. What's life like there? What could we expect to happen?
We won't get what they get because we're not them. And Russia and China are both immensely different societies, different histories from us. We will get a strong state with a particularly British, indeed English character, which I don't care to predict in detail, but you will be less free in everything you do in the years to come. And if you value that, you'll miss it. But what you see in China is the death of the delusion, which was quite common after the Cold War, that when people became prosperous, they would demand liberty and the rule of law and democracy. They didn't. And in China, they became rich, but they continued to live under what is actually one of the worst tyrannies in the world. And the two things were not incompatible. And this is the disaster of China, that one of the great arguments during the Cold War was not merely that the people living under Soviet tyranny were unfree, but also that they were miserably poor and materially far worse off than their neighbors living under the capitalist system. China ended that. And so one of the principal and most appealing arguments for a free society, that it would also be more prosperous, has been lost. It's Shanghai, when I first went there, it just terrified me, not just the vastness of this mega city, unrelieved urbanization, and the frenzied, rather unpleasant energy of it, but this feeling that it was not a boot stamping on a human face forever, but people solely engaged in material occupation with no other objective, and living in a society that was utterly unfree, in which the loins and the wallet were free, but the mind was not. And I find it hard to think of anything more unattractive, really.
Well, thank you very much for joining me here today. It's been fascinating talking to you, and I hope everyone's enjoyed watching. Please comment, please share, and also please become a supporter of Unlocked by clicking the blue supporter button on Facebook at Unlocked United Kingdom. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.